The cold clang of pots echoed through the sterile kitchen, but inside, Maria's heart broke quietly with every scoop of stew she ladled into a silver bowl. She wiped her tears hurriedly on her worn apron, invisible to the world she fed, unheard and unseen like the faintest whisper in a storm. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're preparing dinner for someone who never says thank you, or washing dishes while everyone else sleeps. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. Maria Gonzalez had been the silent heartbeat of the Whitman mansion for 6 long years, her weathered hands creating miracles in a kitchen that gleamed like a surgical theater. The sprawling Pacific Heights estate overlooked San Francisco Bay, its windows catching the morning fog that rolled in like whispered secrets. Every dawn, Maria would arrive through the service entrance, her worn leather watch catching the first rays of sunlight that filtered through the mansion's towering windows. The watch was her grandmother's, scratched and faded, but precious beyond any diamond that adorned Mrs. Whitman's jewelry box. Charles Whitman owned half of Silicon Valley, his tech empire generating millions in revenue through stock market investments and cryptocurrency portfolios that grew overnight like digital wildflowers. His net worth exceeded most small countries' GDP, yet his kitchen, despite its $60,000 Italian appliances and marble countertops imported from Tuscany, felt as cold as a morgue. The Sub-Zero refrigerators hummed with mechanical precision, the 18-burner commercial stove gleamed unused, and the crystal stemware caught light like frozen tears. But when Maria lit the pilot light at 5:30 each morning, something magical happened. The kitchen breathed, it lived, it remembered what it meant to nurture. Her hands moved with practiced grace, cracking eggs with a sound like tiny promises breaking open, whisking them until they became golden silk. The aroma of fresh coffee beans, Colombian, ground by hand in her grandmother's wooden mill, would slowly creep through the mansion's corridors, gently waking a family that had forgotten how to truly taste anything. Maria's morning ritual was sacred. First the coffee, strong and honest, then the bread, kneaded with patience accumulated over decades of silent service. The yeast would bloom under her touch, dough rising like hope in a world that had taught her to expect nothing. Charles would descend the grand staircase at precisely 7:15, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble floors like a metronome counting empty beats. His breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, fresh orange juice, waited for him on Royal Crown Derby china that cost more than Maria's monthly salary. He would eat in silence, scrolling through stock reports on his iPad, his fortune in Bitcoin fluctuating by thousands of dollars with each refresh. Yet he never tasted the love Maria folded into every meal, never noticed how she remembered he preferred his coffee black, his eggs cooked exactly 3 minutes, his toast golden but never burnt. The Whitman children visited sporadically, arriving in their Tesla sedans and Porsche convertibles, bringing wives draped in designer labels and children who spoke in whispers. They treated their father's home like a 5-star hotel, expecting perfect service without acknowledgement. Maria would prepare elaborate Sunday dinners, roasted lamb with rosemary from the garden she tended, potatoes creamed with butter and dreams, vegetables that sang with the memory of soil and sunshine. The family would gather around the mahogany dining table worth more than most people's homes, discussing real estate investments and mutual fund performances while Maria's food grew cold on their plates. But there was one exception to this parade of indifference. Emma, Charles's 10-year-old granddaughter, would slip into the kitchen during family gatherings, drawn by aromas that spoke a language her young heart understood. She would perch on a wooden stool, the only piece of furniture in the kitchen that wasn't stainless steel or marble, watching Maria work with eyes wide as saucers. 6 years had passed since that first morning when Maria knocked on the service door with nothing but hope and her grandmother's recipes memorized in her heart. She remembered Charles interviewing her in his study, surrounded by awards and photographs with politicians and tech moguls. His questions had been sharp, clinical, Could she prepare French cuisine? Did she understand the requirements of entertaining important guests? Could she maintain absolute discretion about family affairs? Maria had nodded, her English still rough around the edges, not mentioning that her real expertise lay in the simple magic of making strangers feel at home through food. The early months had been a careful dance of learning the family's rhythms and preferences. Mrs. Whitman, Evelyn, had passed away just 2 years into Maria's employment, leaving behind a grief-stricken household that didn't know how to process loss. Maria had prepared meal after meal during those dark months, watching Charles push food around his plate like he was moving pieces in a chess game he'd already lost. She cooked his wife's favorite dishes, chicken piccata, lemon bars, beef bourguignon, hoping to coax some spark of life back into his hollow eyes. But Charles retreated deeper into his empire of technology and money, finding solace in profit margins and investment portfolios rather than human connection. The daily rhythm of the mansion revolved around schedules as precise as Swiss clockwork. Maria would rise at 4:30 in her small apartment in the Mission District, taking 2 buses to reach the mansion before dawn. Her neighborhood was a world away from Pacific Heights, cramped apartments above taquerias, children playing soccer in narrow streets, grandmother sitting on stoops sharing gossip in rapid-fire Spanish. But Maria carried that warmth with her each morning, folding it into every meal she prepared in the sterile grandeur of the Whitman kitchen. By 6 o'clock, she would have fresh bread rising, coffee percolating, and the first preparations for the day's meals underway. Charles liked his lunch at exactly noon, usually something light, a salad or soup, served in his study while he conducted video conferences with investors in Tokyo or London. The afternoon would bring preparations for dinner, whether it was a simple meal for Charles alone or an elaborate spread when his children visited with their families. Maria learned to read the family's moods through their appetites, understanding that James Jr. stress-ate when his tech startup struggled, that daughter Catherine picked at her food when her marriage grew tense, that little Emma devoured everything with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. The kitchen became Maria's sanctuary and her prison, a place where she poured her heart into every dish while remaining fundamentally invisible to those who consumed her love disguised as food. She would watch through the service window as the family gathered for holidays, their conversations floating over roasted turkey and honey-glazed ham, discussions of stock options and profit sharing, vacation homes in the Hamptons and Aspen, private schools and trust funds. They lived in a world where money flowed like water, where success was measured in assets and net worth rather than the simple satisfaction of feeding someone you care about. Yet, Maria found her joy in small moments, the way Charles's face would soften slightly when he tasted her homemade tortilla soup, how Emma would literally bounce with excitement when she smelled fresh cookies baking, the grateful silence that settled over the dinner table when a particularly perfect meal rendered even the Whitmans speechless with appreciation. These moments sustained her through the longer stretches of thankless work, through the comments that stung like paper cuts. The help knows to use the service entrance, or make sure the cleaning lady doesn't touch the good china. Maria was neither the cleaning lady nor mere help, but in the Whitman household, all service workers blurred together into a single category: invisible, interchangeable, unimportant. Her grandmother's watch ticked steadily on her wrist, marking the passage of hours spent in devoted service to a family that saw her as nothing more than another expensive appliance. But Maria understood something the Whitmans had forgotten in their pursuit of wealth and status: that food prepared with love carries a power beyond nutrition, that kitchens can be churches where daily miracles of transformation occur, that the hands that feed us deserve more recognition than the investments that merely make money multiply. The morning sun climbed higher over San Francisco Bay as Maria began preparing for another day of invisible service, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her worth would be measured not in the love she poured into every meal, but in the silence with which she served it. The mansion's kitchen hummed with anticipation, waiting for the magic that only Maria could create, the transformation of expensive ingredients into something that tasted like home, even in a place that had forgotten what home actually meant. But change was coming to the Whitman mansion, arriving like fog rolling in from the Pacific, quiet at first, then overwhelming everything in its path. Maria couldn't have known that this particular morning would be different from all the others, that the routine she'd perfected over 6 years was about to shatter like crystal hitting marble. She simply continued her work, hands steady and heart hopeful, preparing to feed a family that would soon learn the true cost of taking love for granted. The rhythm of the Whitman household had become as predictable as the stock market's opening bell, and Maria moved through her days with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to find poetry in routine. Each morning brought the same carefully choreographed dance, coffee brewing in precisely measured portions, breakfast plates warmed to the perfect temperature, fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases throughout the main floors. The mansion's worth, estimated at $47 million according to the latest property assessment, seemed to multiply around Maria's quiet presence, as if her dedication somehow added value to the marble and mahogany that surrounded her. Emma had become Maria's unexpected companion during the long afternoons when the mansion felt more like a museum than a home. The little girl would appear in the doorway of the kitchen, golden braids bouncing as she skipped across the polished floors. She was Charles's pride, the daughter of his recently divorced son James Jr., whose tech startup had just gone public, adding another $50 million to the family's already substantial portfolio. But Emma seemed untouched by the weight of inherited wealth, drawn instead to the simple magic she witnessed in Maria's hands. Abuela Maria, she would call, using the Spanish word for grandmother that made Maria's heart flutter like a butterfly trapped in her chest. What are you making today?" Emma had learned to pronounce the rolling R's and soft vowels with surprising accuracy, her young tongue adapting to the musical cadences of Maria's native language with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. "Today we make empanadas, mija," Maria would reply, her voice gentle as morning mist rolling across the bay. "But first, you help me with the masa, yes?" Emma would roll up her sleeves, designer clothes that cost more than Maria's monthly rent, and plunge her small hands into the flour mixture without hesitation. Together, they would work in comfortable silence, the child's questions punctuating their shared labor like musical notes. "Why do you put your fingers like that when you pinch the edges?" Emma asked one afternoon, watching Maria's weathered hands transform circles of dough into perfect golden crescents. "Ah, this is how my abuela taught me," Maria explained, her fingers moving with unconscious artistry. "See? When you pinch with love, the empanada holds its secret safe inside. When you pinch with anger or hurry, everything falls apart." Emma nodded solemnly, as if Maria had shared the secrets of the universe rather than a simple cooking technique. These moments of connection sustained Maria through the less gentle aspects of her employment. Charles's eldest daughter, Catherine, visited monthly with her investment banker husband and their twin boys. Catherine had inherited her father's sharp tongue and her late mother's sense of entitlement, treating the mansion like her personal stage for displaying wealth and superiority. She would sweep through the kitchen in her designer heels, leaving orders like breadcrumbs. "Make sure the salmon is wild caught, not farmed," or "The boys are lactose intolerant this week. No dairy in anything." Her commands carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, her voice sharp as the sound of her credit card slicing through air as she made another luxury purchase. The twins, Preston and Parker, embodied their mother's dismissive attitude toward anyone they considered beneath their social station. At 14, they had already learned to speak about the help as if Maria were furniture that occasionally moved. During one particularly painful afternoon, Preston had complained loudly about the weird smell coming from the kitchen while Maria prepared pozole, a traditional soup that carried the memory of her mother's Sunday dinners. "Can't she cook normal food?" he had asked his mother, his voice carrying clearly through the service window. Catherine's response had been worse than agreement. She'd simply ignored the question, as if Maria's cultural heritage wasn't even worth acknowledging, let alone defending. But the cruelest wounds came from James Jr., Charles's son and Emma's father. His tech company's success had inflated his ego like a balloon filled with toxic gas, and he seemed to take particular pleasure in diminishing Maria whenever possible. "Anyone can throw some spices in a pot," he'd sneer when guests complimented the evening's meal. "We pay her to follow recipes, not create art." His words stung worse because of the casual cruelty behind them, the dismissal of skills that had taken decades to develop, the reduction of love and creativity to mere mechanical following of instructions. Maria would absorb these comments like rain soaking into parched earth, her face maintaining the neutral expression she'd perfected over years of service. But inside, each dismissive word carved another small wound in her sense of self-worth. She would retreat to the kitchen after these encounters, hands trembling slightly as she continued her work, grandmother's watch ticking steadily on her wrist like a quiet heartbeat, reminding her that she was more than their opinions suggested. The financial discussions that drifted through the mansion like background music painted a picture of wealth so vast it seemed almost abstract. Charles's portfolio included early investments in major tech companies, real estate holdings across 3 states, and a cryptocurrency collection worth more than some small nation's annual budgets. His weekly meetings with financial advisors took place in his study, voices carrying through the mansion's perfect acoustics as they discussed asset allocation and inheritance planning. Maria would overhear fragments while dusting the adjacent rooms. "The Bitcoin position has appreciated 23% this quarter," or "we should consider moving more funds into emerging markets." These conversations happened in the same house where Maria counted every dollar of her modest salary, where she bought ingredients with careful consideration for their cost, where she mended her own clothes rather than replacing them. The contrast was most stark during the family's elaborate dinner parties, when Maria would prepare feasts that cost more than her monthly salary while remaining invisible to the guests who consumed her labor. Business partners and society figures would fill the dining room, their conversations a symphony of privilege, discussions of private jet schedules, vacation homes in exotic locations, children attending elite universities. They praised the food with the casual appreciation reserved for beautiful scenery, never considering that a human being had poured hours of skill and care into each perfectly prepared dish. One evening, as Maria served a 7-course meal to 12 guests, she overheard a conversation that crystallized the vast gulf between her world and theirs. A woman whose diamond bracelet probably cost more than Maria's annual salary was complaining about her housekeeper's request for a raise. "She wants an extra $50 a week," the woman laughed. "I spend more than that on my morning coffee order. These people have no concept of money." The table erupted in sympathetic laughter while Maria continued serving, her face a mask of professional neutrality, even as her heart burned with the injustice of being dismissed so casually by people whose comfort depended entirely on workers like her. Yet Maria persevered, finding purpose in the small victories that others might consider insignificant. When Charles smiled, actually smiled, upon tasting her homemade flan, she treasured that moment like a precious gem. When Emma burst into the kitchen demanding to know the secret ingredient in her arroz con leche, it was cinnamon and unconditional love, Maria felt rich beyond measure. When James Jr.'s latest girlfriend quietly asked for the recipe for the mole sauce, whispering that it was absolutely incredible, Maria experienced a quiet pride that no amount of money could purchase. The seasons changed around the mansion's perfectly climate-controlled environment, marked not by weather, but by the shifting rhythms of the family's social calendar. Spring brought graduation parties and charity galas. Summer meant preparation for extended vacations, packing elaborate picnic baskets for yacht excursions, coordinating with catering services for events Maria wasn't skilled enough to handle alone, according to family opinion. Fall brought holiday preparations that began in October and stretched through New Year's, an endless parade of entertaining that left Maria exhausted, but oddly fulfilled. Through it all, Emma remained her bright spot, the one member of the family who saw Maria as fully human. The little girl would appear at Maria's apartment door on occasional weekends, having convinced her father to let her visit to practice her Spanish. Together, they would explore the Mission District, Emma's eyes wide with wonder at the colorful murals, the street vendors selling elotes and paletas, the sounds and smells that comprised Maria's real home. "It's so different from Grandpa's house," Emma would observe with a child's unfiltered honesty. "It feels more alive." Maria would nod, understanding exactly what the girl meant, even if she couldn't articulate why wealth sometimes seemed to drain the life out of living. These visits became precious rituals, cementing a bond that transcended the artificial barriers of class and culture. Maria would teach Emma to make tortillas from scratch, the girl's small hands learning to feel when the masa reached the perfect consistency. They would visit the parish church where Maria lit candles for her deceased family members, Emma sitting quietly in the pew while Maria prayed for strength to continue serving with dignity. On one memorable afternoon, Emma asked why Maria always wore the same old watch when her grandfather's collection included timepieces worth more than cars. Maria had struggled to explain in words a 10-year-old could understand, how some things carry value that can't be measured in dollars, how love transforms simple objects into treasures beyond price. But the comfortable rhythm of these years was building toward a disruption that none of them could have anticipated. Change was approaching the Whitman mansion like a storm front gathering strength over the Pacific, and Maria's quiet world of invisible service was about to collide with forces that would test every lesson she'd learned about patience, dignity, and the true meaning of worth. The watch on her wrist continued its steady ticking, counting down moments toward a confrontation that would reveal just how much the Whitman family had taken for granted, and how much they stood to lose when the woman who held their world together finally reached her breaking point. The morning sun struggled through San Francisco's famous fog as Maria unlocked the service entrance to the Whitman mansion, her grandmother's leather watch catching fragments of filtered light. 6 years of this same routine had worn grooves in her soul deeper than the paths her feet had traced across the kitchen's marble floors. Today felt different somehow. The air carried a tension she couldn't name, like the atmospheric pressure that shifts before an earthquake. But Maria pushed aside her unease, focusing instead on the familiar comfort of her pre-dawn rituals. Charles was already awake when she arrived, unusual for a man who typically didn't stir until 7. She could hear his voice echoing from his study, animated in a way that suggested good news from his financial advisors. The cryptocurrency markets had been particularly volatile lately, and his portfolio had gained another $3 million overnight, while most of America slept. His conversations with wealth managers had become more frequent, discussions of diversifying assets and expanding international investments filtering through the mansion like background music to Maria's daily symphony of cooking and cleaning. "The semiconductor stocks are up 18% this quarter," Charles was saying into his phone, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone accustomed to winning. "And the Bitcoin position? Extraordinary. We should consider moving more capital into emerging technologies." Maria moved quietly through her morning preparations, assembling ingredients for the day's meals while Charles conducted business that generated more money in an hour than she earned in a year. Emma arrived that afternoon with her father, James Jr., who seemed particularly agitated about something related to his company's latest funding round. His startup had been valued at over $200 million, but apparently that wasn't enough to satisfy his ambitions. "We need to close the Series C before the end of the quarter," he was telling someone on his phone as Emma slipped away to find Maria in the kitchen. "The investors are getting nervous about market conditions, and we can't afford to lose momentum." "Abuela Maria!" Emma's voice cut through the financial jargon like sunshine penetrating clouds. "Can we make conchas today, please?" Maria smiled, her first genuine expression of happiness all morning. Conchas, Mexican sweetbread shaped like shells, were Emma's favorite, though they required hours of patient work that Maria was usually too pressed for time to attempt during regular service. "Sí, mija, but you must help me with the topping," Maria replied, already reaching for the flour and sugar. "And you must be very careful. Your papa doesn't like when you get messy." James Jr. had made his feelings clear about Emma's kitchen visits, viewing them as unsuitable for a child of her social standing. "She needs to learn proper behavior," he'd told Charles more than once, "not how to play with the help." But Emma was already rolling up her sleeves, determined to master the art of the conch's distinctive shell pattern. They worked together in comfortable silence, Maria's hands guiding Emma's smaller ones as they shaped the dough and created the crisscross designs that gave the bread its name. "Why do you always make everything look so beautiful?" Emma asked, watching Maria's weathered fingers create perfect spirals with effortless grace. "Because food is love made visible," Maria replied softly. "When we cook with our hearts, people can taste the caring. It makes them feel—" She paused, searching for words in English to express concepts that flowed naturally in Spanish. "It makes them feel like they belong somewhere, like home." Emma nodded solemnly, absorbing this wisdom with the gravity she reserved for truly important lessons. "Is that why Grandpa always looks sad when he eats? Because he doesn't feel at home?" The question caught Maria off guard with its devastating accuracy. Charles did look sad during meals, his expensive suits hanging on his thin frame like costumes he wore, but didn't quite believe in. "Your grandfather carries heavy thoughts," Maria said carefully. "Sometimes when people have many responsibilities, they forget how to taste happiness." She didn't add that wealth itself seemed to weigh Charles down, that his millions in assets appeared to provide everything except the simple satisfaction of sharing a meal with someone who cared about him. Their baking session was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine and her family, their voices preceding them into the house like an advancing army. The twins, Preston and Parker, bounded into the kitchen with the careless energy of teenagers who had never been denied anything they wanted. "What's that smell?" Preston wrinkled his nose dramatically. "It's like foreign or something." "It's conchas," Emma replied proudly. "Maria is teaching me how to make them. They're delicious." But her cousins exchanged glances that Maria recognized all too well, the look of young people who had been taught that anything outside their narrow experience was somehow inferior or suspicious. "Why would you want to learn that?" Parker asked with casual cruelty. "Mom says people like her only know how to make peasant food anyway." The words hit Maria like physical blows, but she kept her face neutral, continuing to work the dough while her heart burned with silent outrage. These boys, who had never known hunger or want, dismissing traditions that had sustained families for generations. Catherine entered the kitchen then, her designer heels clicking against the marble floors like castanets, keeping time with Maria's internal fury. "Emma, darling, you shouldn't be back here bothering the staff," she said with false sweetness. "Maria has work to do, and you have homework." Her tone carried the implicit assumption that Maria's time wasn't valuable, that teaching a child to bake was somehow interfering with more important tasks. "But we're making conchas," Emma protested. "Maria is showing me how to make the shells perfect, and she told me about how food is love made visible and—" Catherine cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Emma, that's enough. You can play kitchen with your toys at home. Come along now." She turned to Maria with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "I'm sure you understand. Children need structure, not distractions." The pause before distractions carried particular weight, transforming Maria and everything she represented into an obstacle to proper child-rearing. Emma's face crumpled with disappointment, but she obediently followed her aunt from the kitchen, casting one longing glance back at the half-formed conchas cooling on the counter. Maria finished the bread alone, her movements automatic while her mind churned with frustration and hurt. This was her daily reality, being dismissed and diminished by people who depended on her labor while simultaneously denying her basic human dignity. The evening brought James Jr.'s latest triumph in the form of a dinner party celebrating his company's acquisition of a smaller startup. The dining room filled with tech industry luminaries and venture capitalists, their conversations heavy with talk of valuations and market disruption. Maria prepared an elaborate spread: seared scallops with cauliflower puree, duck confit with cherry gastrique, chocolate soufflé with gold leaf garnish, each dish representing hours of skilled labor that would be consumed in minutes and forgotten by morning. As she served the final course, Maria overheard a conversation that crystallized everything wrong with her position in this household. James Jr. was bragging to a potential investor about the efficiency of his father's estate management. "The old man keeps costs down by hiring people who work for practically nothing," he said with a laugh that made Maria's stomach turn. "Our cook, for instance, she's been here 6 years, still grateful for whatever we pay her. No ambition, no demands, perfect employee." "Really?" The investor nodded approvingly. "Smart hiring. Why pay market rates when you can find people who just appreciate having work at all?" His tone suggested he viewed employees like Maria as commodities rather than human beings deserving fair compensation and respect. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she cleared the dessert plates, each piece of china worth more than her weekly salary. These men sat in their expensive suits, discussing her salary and worth as casually as they might debate the merits of different investment portfolios. They saw her as nothing more than another asset to be managed, her value measured only in terms of cost savings and convenience. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the kitchen had been restored to its sterile perfection, Maria sat alone at the small table in the service area where she took her meals. The conchas she'd made with Emma sat untouched in a covered basket. There had been no time to finish baking them properly with all the dinner party preparations. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through photos from her weekend visits with Emma to the Mission District, images of a child discovering joy in simple pleasures, street art, pupusa vendors, mariachi music drifting from corner cafes. Those moments with Emma represented everything Maria valued about her work: the opportunity to nurture and teach, to pass on traditions and create connections that transcended social boundaries. But they felt increasingly fragile in the face of the family's casual dismissal of her worth. How long could she continue serving people who viewed her as little more than an expensive appliance? How many more conversations about her expendability could she overhear before something inside her finally broke? The grandmother's watch on her wrist ticked steadily through these dark thoughts, its familiar weight a reminder of the woman who had taught Maria that dignity wasn't something others could grant or take away. It was something you carried inside yourself, like a flame that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. But even flames needed oxygen to survive, and Maria was beginning to feel like the air was being slowly squeezed from her lungs by the accumulated weight of years of invisible service. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same routine, cooking elaborate meals for people who consumed her labor without gratitude, cleaning spaces that would be dirtied again within hours, maintaining the smooth operation of a household that ran on her efforts while denying her basic recognition. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of the mansion's kitchen, Maria allowed herself to wonder what would happen if she simply stopped cooking, stopped serving, stopped pretending that her dreams and dignity mattered less than the Whitmans' comfort and convenience. The answer to that question was approaching faster than anyone in the mansion could have imagined, carried on winds of change that would soon transform their carefully maintained world of wealth and privilege into something far more uncertain and revealing. Spring arrived in San Francisco with its usual dramatic flair, fog lifting to reveal crystalline views of the bay that made even the most jaded tech millionaires pause in appreciation. But for Maria, the season brought an unwelcome change that would test everything she'd learned about patience and perseverance during her 6 years of service to the Whitman family. Charles had made a decision that would shake the foundation of their carefully established routine. He was hiring a celebrity chef. The announcement came on a Thursday morning while Maria was preparing Charles's usual breakfast of steel-cut oats and fresh berries. She overheard his phone conversation with what sounded like a high-end culinary agency, his voice animated with excitement she hadn't heard since Emma's last visit. "Yes, I want someone with serious credentials, he was saying. Michelin stars, television appearances, the works. Money is no object. I want the best. Maria's hand stilled over the oatmeal, a cold dread settling in her stomach like stones dropping into still water. Chef Roland Dubois arrived the following Monday with the fanfare typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. His black BMW pulled through the mansion's gates at precisely 10 o'clock, followed by a smaller vehicle loaded with knife cases, specialized equipment, and an assistant who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the chef's impressive resume. Roland had trained at Le Cordon Bleu, worked under Marco Pierre White, earned 2 Michelin stars for his restaurant in Lyon before relocating to New York, where he'd built an empire of trendy establishments frequented by celebrities and food critics. Maria watched from the kitchen window as Charles personally greeted the chef at the front entrance, a courtesy he'd never extended to her in 6 years of employment. Roland was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 45, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a precise ponytail, and the kind of confident bearing that comes from years of being treated as an artist rather than mere service staff. His handshake with Charles lasted longer than strictly necessary, a bonding ritual between men who understood each other's worth in terms of money and status. He'll be here for 3 months, Charles explained to Maria later that afternoon, his tone suggesting this was wonderful news she should receive with gratitude. Chef Dubois will be redesigning our entire approach to entertaining and daily meals. You'll assist him, of course. He'll need someone familiar with our routines and preferences. The casual dismissal in that phrase, "You'll assist him," reduced 6 years of skilled, devoted service to the role of kitchen helper, but Maria simply nodded and murmured appropriate responses about being happy to help. Roland's first inspection of the kitchen revealed his personality with uncomfortable clarity. He moved through the space like a general surveying conquered territory, opening cabinets with dramatic flair and muttering in French about the provincial organization of equipment. "Who arranged these spices?" he demanded, his accent adding weight to what would have been simply rude in plain English. "This is chaos disguised as order. And where are the proper reduction pans, the mandolin? How does one create art with such domestic tools?" Maria bit back the response that her domestic tools had produced countless meals that brought genuine pleasure to the family, that her organized chaos had fed them consistently and lovingly for years. Instead, she quietly explained where to find items he might need and offered to show him the locations of specialty markets where he could order any equipment the current kitchen lacked. His response was a dismissive wave. "My assistant will handle procurement. What I need from you is simple. Stay out of my way unless specifically called upon." The words hit like slaps, reducing her from head cook to beneath-notice helper in her own domain. The kitchen where she'd created countless small miracles suddenly felt foreign, as if Roland's presence had recalibrated the very atmosphere to exclude her. The family's response to Roland was everything Maria had never received: enthusiastic appreciation, eager anticipation, and the kind of respect reserved for someone whose talents they recognized and valued. Charles bragged to his business associates about securing one of the country's top chefs, the pride in his voice making it clear that Roland's reputation reflected positively on Charles's status in ways that Maria's quiet competence never could. Emma's reaction was the hardest to witness. When she bounded into the kitchen the following Saturday, expecting to find Maria ready for their usual baking session, she stopped short at the sight of Roland commanding the space like a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony. "Where's Abuela Maria?" she asked with the directness of childhood, looking around as if Maria might be hiding behind the industrial refrigerators. "The staff person. She's around somewhere, I'm sure," Roland replied without looking up from the elaborate sauce he was constructing. "But this is a professional kitchen today, little one. Perhaps you could play elsewhere." His dismissal of Emma struck Maria as particularly cruel. The child had brought such joy to these kitchen sessions, and now even that small happiness was being swept away by Roland's theatrical takeover. Maria found herself relegated to prep work, chopping vegetables to Roland's exacting specifications, washing his expensive equipment, running errands to specialty food stores for ingredients she'd never heard of, despite decades of cooking experience. Her carefully developed relationships with local vendors meant nothing to Roland, who insisted on ordering from high-end suppliers who charged triple the cost for items Maria could source just as easily from familiar markets in the Mission District. The first dinner party Roland prepared for the Whitmans was a production worthy of theatrical documentation. He imported special plates from France, hired additional servers, and created a menu that read like poetry but tasted like pretension. Each course was an architectural marvel, towers of foam and reduction, proteins arranged with geometric precision, garnishes that looked beautiful but contributed nothing to flavor. The guests were appropriately impressed, their praise flowing like wine as they photographed each course for their social media accounts. But Maria noticed what the guests didn't. Charles pushed most of his food around the plate untouched, his expression polite but distant. The elaborate presentation couldn't disguise the fact that Roland's culinary artistry lacked the warmth and genuine nourishment that had always been Maria's signature. The food was technically perfect and emotionally hollow, like a museum exhibit designed to impress rather than sustain. "He's certainly talented," Charles remarked to Maria the next morning as she cleaned up Roland's elaborate mise en place stations. "Everything looks absolutely professional." The careful phrasing suggested Charles was trying to convince himself as much as her, and Maria wondered if he missed the simple satisfaction of meals that tasted like care rather than ambitious culinary theory. Roland's treatment of Maria grew more dismissive as the weeks passed. He spoke to her, when he spoke to her at all, in the tone one might use with a particularly slow child, explaining basic cooking concepts as if her decades of experience counted for nothing. "When we sauté," he would say with exaggerated patience, "we want the pan very hot before adding oil. This creates the proper searing effect." Maria would nod and continue working, biting back the impulse to mention that she'd been achieving perfect searing for longer than Roland had been alive. The breaking point came during preparation for Charles's most important business dinner of the year, a gathering of potential investors for a revolutionary new cryptocurrency venture that could add hundreds of millions to the family portfolio. Roland had planned an elaborate tasting menu featuring exotic ingredients and avant-garde techniques that would supposedly reflect Charles's innovative approach to wealth building. The pressure was enormous, with guests including tech moguls whose approval could make or break the investment deal. Maria arrived early that morning to find Roland in an absolute panic. His signature dish, a deconstructed bouillabaisse that required 3 days of preparation, had failed catastrophically. The delicate seafood foam had collapsed, the saffron oil had broken, and the microgreens he'd special ordered from a boutique farm in Sonoma had arrived wilted and unusable. "This is disaster," he shouted in accented English, his professional composure cracking under pressure. "Everything is ruined. My reputation, your employer's evening, all ruined." For a moment, Maria felt genuine sympathy for the chef's distress. She understood the crushing weight of responsibility that came with feeding people whose approval mattered, the way culinary failures reflected not just on professional competence, but on personal worth. But instead of asking for her help or acknowledging her expertise, Roland dismissed her from the kitchen entirely. "I cannot work with distractions," he declared. "Please go find something else to do while I attempt to salvage this catastrophe." Maria retreated to the small staff break room, but she could hear Roland's continued panic through the thin walls, phone calls to suppliers, desperate attempts to recreate failed components, the increasing hysteria of someone accustomed to control-facing public humiliation. Part of her wanted to offer assistance, to share solutions from her own experience with last-minute dinner party crises. But a larger part, the part that had been dismissed and diminished for weeks, chose to remain silent. The dinner party that evening was a qualified disaster disguised as professional competence. Roland managed to replace his failed signature dish with something technically edible but utterly forgettable, and the guest politely consumed what was clearly second-rate work from someone who'd been hired for first-class results. Charles's expression throughout the evening suggested controlled disappointment, the look of a man who'd invested in prestige and received mediocrity in return. But the real catastrophe was still to come, building like storm clouds on the horizon of Maria's increasingly precarious position in the Whitman household. Roland's failure would have consequences that extended far beyond one disappointing meal, creating ripples of suspicion and blame that would soon crash over Maria's quiet life with devastating force. The celebrity chef's presence in her kitchen wasn't just changing the family's meals. It was setting the stage for a confrontation that would test everything Maria believed about justice, dignity, and the true value of honest work. The grandmother's watch on her wrist seemed to tick more urgently now, counting down moments toward a reckoning that none of them could see coming. In the space between Roland's arrogance and the family's expectations, Maria found herself walking a tightrope that grew more precarious with each passing day. The fog that morning hung over San Francisco like a gray wool blanket, muffling the sounds of the city awakening to another day of ambition and commerce. In the Whitman mansion, however, the atmosphere crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with weather patterns and everything to do with the simmering conflict between old traditions and new pretensions. Maria arrived at her usual pre-dawn hour to find the kitchen already occupied by Roland, who was frantically attempting to perfect a signature dessert that had failed spectacularly during 3 previous test runs. Merde! The French expletive echoed through the kitchen as another soufflé collapsed like a deflated dream. Roland's composure, which had impressed Charles so thoroughly during their initial meeting, was cracking under the pressure of consistent failure. His celebrated techniques, which had earned acclaim in Michelin-starred restaurants, somehow fell flat in the Whitman kitchen, as if the space itself rejected his theatrical approach to cooking. Maria moved quietly around the agitated chef, preparing Charles's morning coffee, with the same careful attention she'd maintained for 6 years. The routine grounded her, a steady rhythm that remained constant despite the chaos Roland brought to her orderly world. She measured the Colombian beans with practiced precision, ground them to the exact consistency Charles preferred, and began the brewing process that would fill the mansion with the first comforting aroma of the day. "How do you make such perfect coffee?" Emma's voice startled both adults. The 10-year-old had slipped into the kitchen unnoticed, drawn as always by the sounds and smells that meant home to her young heart. "I mean, Grandpa never complains about it, but he complains about lots of other things lately." Her observation carried the casual honesty of childhood, but it struck both Maria and Roland with uncomfortable accuracy. Roland looked up from his collapsed dessert, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Little girl, this is not a playground. Professional kitchens require concentration," but Emma had already turned away from him, unimpressed by his authoritative tone. Instead, she climbed onto her familiar stool beside Maria, watching with fascination as the coffee finished brewing. "The secret is not in the machine," Maria explained softly, pouring the dark liquid into Charles's preferred china cup. "It's in the caring. When you pay attention to every little step, when you think about making someone happy instead of making something perfect, the difference shows in the taste." Emma nodded solemnly, absorbing this wisdom while Roland snorted dismissively from his station. "Sentiment does not create perfect extraction ratios," he muttered, returning to his troubled soufflé. "Cooking is science, not emotion." But even as he spoke, Maria noticed his hands trembling slightly as he separated eggs, the physical manifestation of stress that no amount of technical training could disguise. The morning's first real crisis arrived with James Jr., who burst into the kitchen with his phone pressed to his ear and his face flushed with the excitement of potential wealth. "The Series C is closing today," he announced to no one in particular. $250 million minimum. We're about to be seriously rich. His tech startup's latest funding round represented the kind of windfall that most people could only dream about. but in the Whitman household, it was simply another step toward ever greater accumulations of capital. Finally, some good news in this house, Roland declared, apparently deciding that flattery might improve his standing with the family. Such success deserves a celebratory meal that matches the magnitude of the achievement. Perhaps I could prepare something truly spectacular for this evening. His eagerness was almost painful to witness, a desperate attempt to attach himself to the family's good fortune. But James Jr. was already moving toward the door, his attention consumed by the flood of congratulatory calls and investment details that required immediate attention. "Whatever, just make it good," he tossed over his shoulder. "We'll have some important people coming by to finalize paperwork. Make sure everything is perfect." The casual dismissal carried the same lack of recognition that Maria had endured for years, except Roland's pride seemed far more fragile than her seasoned resilience. Emma lingered in the kitchen after her father departed, her young face troubled by emotions she couldn't quite articulate. "Why does everyone always act like money is the most important thing?" she asked Maria, her voice carrying a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 10 years. "Daddy talks about billions and millions, but he never talks about being happy." Maria paused in her morning preparations, struck by the profound sadness in Emma's observation. "Money is important, mija," she replied carefully. "It pays for food and homes and safety, but it cannot buy the things that make your heart feel full, like family dinners where everyone laughs, or birthday cakes made with love, or the feeling of someone caring about your dreams." Emma nodded thoughtfully, filing away another piece of wisdom that would serve her well in navigating the complicated world of inherited wealth. The afternoon brought preparation for the evening celebration, but Roland's anxiety had reached fever pitch. His confidence, already shaken by weeks of inconsistent results, crumbled entirely when his assistant called to report that several key ingredients had been delayed by shipping problems. The molecular gastronomy techniques that had made his reputation required precise timing and specific components, and any disruption in the supply chain threatened the entire elaborate production he'd planned. "This is impossible," Roland declared, his accent thickening with stress. "How can I create art without the proper materials? This dinner will be a catastrophe." His panic filled the kitchen like smoke, making the space feel claustrophobic and chaotic in ways it had never been during Maria's solitary tenure. Maria watched his breakdown with a mixture of sympathy and professional assessment. She could see solutions he couldn't, simpler preparations that would satisfy the guests' expectations while working within the constraints of available ingredients. But Roland's ego prevented him from accepting help, especially from someone he'd dismissed as merely supportive staff. His culinary training had taught him to create complex presentations, but not how to adapt gracefully when circumstances demanded flexibility. The evening's guests began arriving at 7 o'clock, their conversations heavy with the intoxicating aroma of successful deal-making. Venture capitalists and tech executives filled the mansion's reception rooms, their handshakes firm with the satisfaction of men who had just moved hundreds of millions of dollars around like chess pieces on a global board. The anticipation for dinner was high. Charles had been bragging about his celebrity chef for weeks, building expectations that now felt dangerously elevated. Roland served his meal with theatrical presentation that couldn't disguise fundamental problems with execution. The proteins were overcooked, the sauces broken, the supposedly innovative flavor combinations jarring rather than harmonious. Maria watched from the service window as guests politely consumed food that fell far short of the standards they had expected, their conversations growing more strained as the evening progressed. Charles's face reflected controlled disappointment that gradually transformed into something approaching embarrassment. His investment in Roland's reputation was proving to be a costly mistake, played out in front of business associates whose respect was crucial to his continued success. The failed dinner party represented more than culinary disappointment. It suggested poor judgment that could affect future business relationships. But the real disaster was yet to come, building toward a crisis that would shatter Maria's carefully maintained world with devastating finality. In the aftermath of Roland's public failure, someone would need to bear responsibility for the embarrassment, and the celebrity chef was far too expensive and well-connected to blame. The invisible cook who had served faithfully for 6 years, however, represented a much more convenient target for the family's frustration and disappointment. The mansion's grandfather clock chimed midnight as the last guests finally departed, leaving behind them a wake of disappointed expectations and uncomfortable silences. Maria began her familiar routine of cleaning up after an evening's entertainment, but she could sense that something fundamental had shifted in the household's dynamics. The air felt charged with unspoken recriminations, and her grandmother's watch seemed to tick more urgently on her wrist, as if time itself was accelerating toward some unavoidable confrontation. Roland had retreated to his temporary quarters, no doubt planning how to shift blame for the evening's failures onto external circumstances and support staff. But Maria understood the patterns of wealthy households well enough to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. When powerful people faced public embarrassment, they needed someone to hold responsible, someone without the resources to defend themselves or the social connections to retaliate. In the morning, that reckoning would come for her with all the force of accumulated disappointment and misplaced anger. The kitchen fell silent around her as she completed the last of her cleaning duties, unconsciously savoring what she couldn't know would be among her final moments in the space that had become both sanctuary and prison over 6 years of devoted service. The next morning arrived with false normalcy, fog lifting to reveal golden California sunshine that should have promised hope, but instead felt like stage lighting for the approaching drama. Maria completed her usual pre-dawn arrival and routine preparation, finding the kitchen still redolent with the lingering disappointment of the previous evening's failed dinner party. Roland was nowhere to be seen, probably sleeping off what she imagined had been a night of extensive self-recrimination and wine consumption. Charles appeared earlier than usual, his face set in the granite expression that meant serious business discussion was imminent. He poured himself coffee from the pot Maria had prepared, but his movements carried none of the subtle satisfaction he typically showed when tasting her perfectly brewed morning ritual. Instead, he seemed distracted, agitated, like a man working up courage for an unpleasant conversation. "Maria," he began, his voice carrying formal distance that immediately put her on alert. "We need to discuss last night's difficulties." The pause before difficulties was loaded with implications that made her stomach clench with preemptive dread. Before she could respond, James Jr. entered the kitchen, his phone pressed to his ear as usual, but his attention clearly focused on the conversation he had interrupted. "Let me call you back," he told whoever was on the line, then turned to face Maria with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, suspicious, almost predatory. "Dad's being diplomatic," James Jr. said without preamble. "But I'll be direct. Something went missing last night during all the chaos of that disaster dinner. Mom's diamond necklace, the Cartier piece worth about $300,000. He paused to let the magnitude of the missing item sink in, watching Maria's face for any telltale signs of guilt or panic. Maria felt the blood drain from her face, but not from guilt, from the terrible recognition of what was happening. She was being set up, blamed for something she had absolutely nothing to do with, transformed from loyal employee into convenient scapegoat for the family's embarrassment and real problems. I don't understand," she stammered, her English becoming more heavily accented under stress. "It's quite simple," Charles continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his version of events accepted without question. "The necklace was in my late wife's jewelry box yesterday afternoon. After last night's complications, it's no longer there. You were in and out of the main house all evening. You have access to the private family quarters for cleaning duties, and frankly, you're the only person who would have both opportunity and," he paused delicately, "motivation for such an act." The accusation hit Maria like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs and making her legs suddenly unsteady. 6 years of faithful service, of devotion that went far beyond mere employment, reduced to criminal suspicion based on nothing more than her social class and ethnicity. Mr. Whitman, I would never. Your family has been so good to me. I would never steal anything, ever. But even as the words tumbled from her lips, she could see they weren't being believed. James Jr. stepped closer, his expression hardening into something approaching cruelty. Come on, Maria. You think we don't know how much money you send back to Mexico every month? How you're always talking about your family needing this or that? $300,000 would solve a lot of problems for someone in your position. His voice carried the casual racism of someone who had never questioned his assumptions about people different from himself. I send money to help my sick mother, Maria replied, her voice barely above a whisper. $50, maybe $75 when I can manage it. I've never stolen anything in my life. Not even a piece of bread when I was hungry. But her defense sounded weak even to her own ears, the desperation in her voice somehow confirming rather than dispelling their suspicions. Roland chose that moment to make his appearance, looking haggard and defensive, but clearly having heard enough of the conversation to understand its general direction. This is terrible business, he declared with theatrical concern. In France, we have very strict policies about staff access to valuable items, perhaps better security measures. His words carried the clear implication that he considered Maria's guilt a foregone conclusion. We've already called the police, Charles announced with finality that made Maria's knees buckle. They'll want to search your apartment, interview you formally, all the usual procedures. Until this matter is resolved, your employment is suspended indefinitely. The businesslike tone made the devastation sound routine, professional. Just another problem being efficiently managed. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment, drawn by the unusual gathering and the tension in the adult voices. "What's happening?" she asked with the directness of childhood. "Why does everyone look so angry, and why is Abuela Maria crying?" "Go to your room, Emma," James Jr. commanded sharply. "This doesn't concern you." But Emma remained rooted in place, her young face reflecting confusion and growing alarm as she processed the adult's expressions and body language. "Did Abuela Maria do something wrong?" Emma asked, her voice small but clear. "Because I know she didn't. She would never hurt anyone or take anything that wasn't hers. She told me that stealing makes your heart heavy, and her heart is always light when she cooks." The child's testimony carried an innocence that should have given the adults pause, but their minds were already made up. "Emma, please," Charles said more gently. "These are complicated adult matters. Maria is going to go home for a while, that's all." But Emma was old enough to recognize evasion when she heard it, and her eyes filled with tears that made Maria's heart break even more completely. The police arrived within the hour, 2 officers who treated the situation with professional courtesy, but obvious assumptions about guilt and innocence based on the mansion's grandeur versus Maria's humble appearance. They questioned her briefly, searched her small purse and coat pockets, and took down information about her address and family contacts. Throughout the process, Maria maintained her dignity with tremendous effort, answering their questions truthfully while fighting back tears that would only confirm the Whitman's suspicions. "We'll need you to come to the station this afternoon for a more complete interview," one officer explained apologetically. "And we'll require access to your apartment for a search, standard procedure in cases like this." Maria nodded numbly, understanding that her life was being turned inside out based on nothing more than proximity and prejudice. The final humiliation came as she was preparing to leave. Charles handed her a formal termination letter that had clearly been prepared by lawyers, legal language that dissolved 6 years of service into phrases like immediate suspension pending investigation and termination of employment for cause. But worse than the corporate formality was the personal coldness in his eyes, the way he looked at her now as if she were a stranger who had somehow infiltrated his home. "I'm disappointed," he said quietly. "I trusted you." The simple statement carried more devastation than any accusation, suggesting that her presumed betrayal was particularly painful because of the confidence he'd placed in her. Maria wanted to scream that his trust hadn't been misplaced, that she valued his family's well-being more than any material possession, but the words wouldn't come. She removed her apron with shaking hands, folding it carefully out of habit even though she knew she would never wear it again. Her grandmother's watch caught the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen windows, its worn leather strap and simple face somehow looking shabby in comparison to the luxury surrounding them. But it remained the most precious thing she owned, a connection to love and family that no amount of money could purchase or suspicion could tarnish. Emma broke free from her father's restraining hand and ran to embrace Maria, her small arms wrapping around the older woman's waist with fierce loyalty. "I don't care what they say," she whispered urgently. "I know you didn't do anything bad. I know you." Maria hugged the child back, tasting salt from tears she couldn't hold back any longer. "Be good, Misha," Maria whispered back. "Remember what we learned about cooking with love. That lesson works for living too. Even when people are unkind, you keep your heart soft, yes?" Emma nodded solemnly, committing this final piece of wisdom to memory like a sacred promise. The walk to the service entrance felt endless, each step carrying Maria further from the only stability she'd known for 6 years. Behind her, the kitchen fell silent, no longer her domain, but a sterile space that would continue functioning without the warmth and care she'd brought to every meal, every moment. Her watch continued its steady ticking, marking time that now felt precious and limited, counting down moments toward an uncertain future that would test every resource of strength and faith she possessed. As the mansion's gates closed behind her, Maria understood that she was walking into the most difficult chapter of her life. But she carried with her something the Whitmans couldn't take away: the knowledge of her own innocence, the memory of Emma's unwavering faith, and the quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of invisible service. These intangible assets would have to be enough to see her through the storm that was only beginning to gather around her seemingly shattered world. The fog that had lifted earlier now began rolling back in from the Pacific, wrapping San Francisco in gray uncertainty that matched the confusion in Maria's heart as she made her way home to face whatever consequences awaited her in a world that had suddenly become hostile and unrecognizable. 6 months passed like a slow-motion disaster, each day bleeding into the next with the gray uniformity of San Francisco fog that never quite lifted. Maria's small apartment in the Mission District had become both sanctuary and prison, a place where she could retreat from a world that now looked at her with suspicious eyes while struggling to rebuild a life that had been shattered by false accusations and lost trust. The police investigation had concluded quickly. Too quickly, Maria thought, with a finding of insufficient evidence to proceed with charges. But in the court of public opinion that mattered most for employment prospects, the dismissal carried less weight than the original accusation. Word had spread through the tight network of domestic workers and service professionals that comprised her world. The woman who might have stolen from the wealthy family that trusted her became a whispered warning passed between housekeepers and cooks. Be careful hiring Maria Gonzalez. Her savings, never substantial on a housekeeper's salary, dwindled with frightening speed. The unemployment benefits she qualified for covered only a fraction of her modest expenses, and each rejected job application felt like another small death of hope. She applied to work for other wealthy families, answered advertisements for restaurant positions, even inquired about factory work that would use none of her culinary skills. But somehow, the story always preceded her. The woman who had worked for the prominent Whitman family until some incident ended her employment under mysterious circumstances. The Mission District had always been her refuge, but now even familiar streets felt different. Mrs. Herrera from the corner tienda still smiled when Maria stopped by for groceries, but the warmth felt strained, clouded by unspoken questions about why someone who had held such a prestigious position was now buying day-old bread and scanning prices with the desperate attention of genuine poverty. The gossip that traveled through Latino communities moved at the speed of light, whispered speculations about what had really happened in that grand Pacific Heights mansion. Only Father Miguel at Saints Peter and Paul Church seemed immune to the swirling rumors, welcoming Maria to confessional with the same gentle attention he'd always shown. "Mija," he said after hearing her tearful account of the false accusations and subsequent hardship, "sometimes our crosses are visible, and sometimes they're invisible. But God sees the truth in our hearts, even when the world prefers comfortable lies." His words provided spiritual comfort, but they didn't pay rent or buy groceries. Maria had been forced to take cleaning jobs that paid by the hour, scrubbing office buildings at dawn, washing dishes in restaurants that were too small to care about her supposed reputation. The work was familiar, but felt hollow after years of creative cooking and family meal preparation. She moved through these tasks like a ghost of her former self, competent but disconnected, going through motions that earned survival wages but provided no satisfaction. The hardest moments came when she allowed herself to remember the Whitman kitchen, the satisfaction of Charles's rare smile when he tasted a particularly successful dish, the joy of teaching Emma traditional recipes, even the simple pleasure of hearing her perfectly timed meals bring the family together around their mahogany dining table. Those memories felt like luxury items she could no longer afford, beautiful but impractical reminders of a life that had been taken from her through no fault of her own. Meanwhile, the Whitman mansion continued its routines without her, but the changes were immediately apparent to anyone who cared to notice. Roland had departed within 2 weeks of Maria's firing, his contract terminated by mutual agreement after a series of additional dinner party failures that made his inaugural disaster look almost competent by comparison. The celebrity chef's ego couldn't withstand the scrutiny that followed his very public collapse, and he retreated to consulting work that kept him safely away from situations requiring consistent performance under pressure. Charles hired a succession of replacement cooks through a high-end domestic agency, professionally trained individuals with impressive resumes and references from other wealthy households. But somehow, none of them managed to capture the intangible quality that had made Maria's cooking feel like home. The meals were technically proficient but emotionally vacant, like restaurant food served in domestic settings. Charles found himself pushing food around his plate more often than eating it, unconsciously searching for flavors that carried warmth and caring rather than mere competence. Emma's reaction to Maria's absence was the most heartbreaking change in the household. The little girl had initially refused to believe her beloved Abuela Maria would simply disappear, insisting that there must be some mistake that would soon be corrected. When weeks turned into months without contact, Emma withdrew into herself, losing interest in cooking and spending long hours in her room, drawing pictures of kitchens filled with warm bread and smiling women who looked remarkably like Maria. "She keeps asking when Maria is coming back," James Jr. complained to his father during one of their regular business dinners. "It's becoming disruptive. Maybe we should consider getting her some counseling to help her move on." But Charles couldn't shake his own discomfort with how the situation had been resolved. The missing necklace had never been found, and Roland's hasty departure had raised questions about the timeline of events that uncomfortable night. The truth began emerging in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across months of denial and willful ignorance. It started when Catherine discovered discrepancies in Roland's expense reports, thousands of dollars charged for ingredients that never appeared in any meals, receipts for equipment that was never delivered to the house. Her accountant's eye for detail revealed patterns of petty theft that painted an uncomfortable picture of the celebrity chef's character. But the revelation that shattered their comfortable assumptions came from an unexpected source. Emma, still grieving Maria's absence, had been searching through old photo albums trying to find pictures that included her former kitchen companion. In a box of family memorabilia stored in her mother's former dressing room, she discovered something that stopped her heart: the missing Cartier necklace, wrapped in tissue paper and hidden behind old hat boxes. The discovery sent shockwaves through the family's carefully maintained narrative about Maria's guilt. If the necklace had been in Evelyn's dressing room all along, then Maria's access to that area during the dinner party chaos became irrelevant. More troubling still was the emerging timeline that suggested Roland had been alone in the house for several hours the morning after the dinner party, handling his own equipment removal while the family dealt with the aftermath of his professional failure. Charles sat in his study that evening, holding his wife's necklace and confronting the magnitude of the injustice they had perpetrated against an innocent woman. The weight in his hands felt heavier than the gold and diamonds could account for. It carried the accumulated guilt of 6 months of willful blindness to an obvious truth. They had destroyed Maria's life and reputation based on nothing more than class prejudice and the convenient assumption that people of her background were inherently more likely to steal than people of Roland's professional standing. The private investigator Charles hired worked with efficiency that highlighted how little investigation had been done initially. Roland's departure from his previous position had involved accusations of theft that were settled privately to avoid scandal. His assistant, when finally interviewed properly, revealed a pattern of missing items and mysterious expenses that had characterized the chef's entire tenure with the Whitmans. The man they had trusted over Maria had a history of exactly the behavior they had accused her of, behavior that had been overlooked because of his prestigious credentials and professional presentation. But understanding the truth and finding Maria to make amends proved to be two different challenges entirely. Her former address in the Mission District led to a new tenant who had no forwarding information. The employment agency that had originally placed her reported no contact in months. It was as if Maria had disappeared entirely, swallowed up by a city that contained millions of invisible workers whose lives never intersected with the comfortable world of wealth and privilege. The search took on increasing urgency as Charles confronted the reality of what they had done. This wasn't merely a mistake that could be corrected with an apology and back pay. They had branded an innocent woman as a thief, destroyed her reputation in a community where word of mouth could make or break employment prospects, and left her to face poverty and social isolation based on their prejudgments and rushed conclusions. Emma's depression deepened as weeks passed without news of Maria's whereabouts, as if the child understood instinctively that some wrongs couldn't be easily fixed once they were set in motion. She stopped eating the elaborate meals prepared by the current cook, pushing food around her plate in unconscious imitation of her grandfather's own discomfort with expensive but soulless cuisine. The mansion's kitchen, despite its professional staff and perfect equipment, felt hollow in ways that money couldn't fix. The warmth that had once filled the space with aromatic promises of comfort and care had been replaced by efficient but impersonal food service that satisfied hunger without feeding the soul. Charles found himself remembering small details he had previously taken for granted, the way Maria's eyes would light up when someone particularly enjoyed a dish she had prepared, her gentle patience with Emma's endless questions about cooking techniques, the almost musical rhythm of her work that had made even routine meal preparation feel like a celebration of abundance and gratitude. The search for Maria continued with growing desperation, but San Francisco was a large city with countless neighborhoods where someone could disappear into the anonymous flow of working-class life. She could be anywhere, cleaning office buildings in the financial district, washing dishes in Chinatown restaurants, working for families who had no connection to the social networks that had originally brought her to the Whitmans' attention. Finding one woman in millions required resources and connections, but more than that, it required her to want to be found by people who had shown her such devastating cruelty. As spring arrived with its usual promise of renewal and hope, Charles began to understand that some mistakes carry consequences that extend far beyond the immediate damage they cause. The woman who had fed his family with such devotion for 6 years might never trust again, might never risk opening her heart to people whose affection could be withdrawn so easily when circumstances became inconvenient. He had learned too late that loyalty was a gift that could be destroyed in moments, but might take a lifetime to rebuild, if rebuilding was even possible after such profound betrayal. The watches on all their wrists continued marking time, But in the Whitman mansion, it felt as if the clocks had stopped on that terrible morning when they chose suspicion over faith, prejudice over justice, and convenient assumptions over the harder work of seeking truth. Now they faced the possibility that some damages were permanent, some losses irreversible, and some people might be gone forever because of choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but revealed themselves as moral failures that would haunt them for years to come. The morning sun struggled through persistent fog as Charles Whitman walked slowly through the Mission District, his expensive shoes clicking against sidewalks that still glistened with overnight moisture. 6 months of searching had led him to this unlikely location, a small community kitchen tucked between a taqueria and a shop selling quinceañera dresses, its modest storefront decorated with hand-painted signs in Spanish and English, promising comida hecha con amor, food made with love. Through the large picture window, Charles could see a familiar figure moving with graceful efficiency between stainless steel prep tables and industrial stoves. Maria Gonzalez looked smaller somehow, her face carrying lines of exhaustion and worry that hadn't been there during her years of service to his family. But her hands moved with the same careful attention he remembered, and the concentration in her expression suggested she had found purpose again, even if circumstances had changed dramatically. The community kitchen served homeless individuals and struggling families, offering hot meals and groceries to anyone who needed them, regardless of their ability to pay. Maria had discovered the place during her darkest weeks after losing her position, initially coming as someone seeking help, but gradually transitioning into a volunteer role when the director recognized her exceptional culinary skills. Now she worked there every morning, arriving before dawn to begin preparations for the day's service. Charles stood outside for several minutes, watching through the window as Maria instructed younger volunteers in proper knife techniques and seasoning balance. Her gentleness with first-time helpers reminded him painfully of her patience with Emma, and he could see that her natural teaching style had found a new outlet among people who appreciated her knowledge without taking it for granted. But he also noticed the careful economy of her movements, the way she stretched ingredients to feed maximum numbers of people, skills developed through months of personal financial hardship that his family's accusations had caused. Finally gathering courage he hadn't needed to use in decades of business negotiations, Charles pushed open the community kitchen's front door. The interior smelled like cumin and fresh tortillas, garlic and hope, aromas that transported him immediately to mornings in his own kitchen when Maria's presence had made even his sterile mansion feel like home. Several volunteers looked up curiously at his appearance. His tailored coat and polished shoes were obviously out of place among the casual clothing and practical shoes, typically worn by people accustomed to long days of service work. Maria's back was turned when he entered, her attention focused on a large pot of soup that would feed 40 people from ingredients that couldn't have cost more than $20. Charles approached slowly, his heart hammering with anxiety he hadn't experienced since his first business presentation decades earlier. When she finally turned and saw him, her face went through a series of expressions, surprise, wariness, and something that might have been fear. "Mr. Whitman," she said quietly, her voice carefully neutral. This is unexpected." She wiped her hands on her apron, not the crisp white uniform she had worn in his kitchen, but a simple canvas apron bearing stains from honest work that served people who needed, rather than merely wanted, good food. "Maria," Charles replied, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I've been looking for you, for months. I need to—" He paused, struggling with words that his business vocabulary hadn't prepared him for. Apologies required humility that mergers and acquisitions never demanded, vulnerability that board meetings actively discouraged. Other volunteers had stopped their work to watch this unusual interaction, sensing drama in the tension between the wealthy man and their beloved kitchen leader. The director, a woman named Carmen, whose own background included years of domestic work before transitioning into non-profit management, moved closer in case Maria needed support dealing with what was clearly a difficult encounter from her past. I know about the necklace, Charles said simply. We found it. In my wife's dressing room, where it had been all along. We know Roland took things that that we were completely wrong about everything. The words tumbled out clumsily, inadequate to express the magnitude of regret and shame he carried. Maria's face remained carefully controlled, but Charles could see tears gathering in her eyes. You found it, she repeated softly. 6 months later, you found it. The quiet statement carried an ocean of pain, months of poverty, social isolation, and damaged reputation that discovery couldn't simply erase. I know an apology isn't enough, Charles continued. I know that what we did to you, the accusations, the way we treated you, the damage to your reputation, I know it can't be fixed with words. But I needed you to know that we understand how wrong we were, how terrible our judgment was, how much we... His voice broke slightly, surprising both of them with its raw emotion. Maria looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to determine whether his remorse was genuine or simply another form of manipulation by wealthy people accustomed to getting what they wanted through charm and money. Finally, she spoke with quiet dignity that shamed him more than anger would have. Do you know what the hardest part was, Mr. Whitman? Not the poverty. I've been poor before, and I can manage being poor again, not even losing my job because there are other jobs. The hardest part was Emma asking me why I had to leave and having no answer that wouldn't break her heart the way mine was broken. Her voice remained steady, but Charles could see the cost of that control in the tension around her eyes. The mention of his granddaughter hit Charles like a physical blow. Emma's depression and withdrawal had been the most visible consequence of Maria's absence, a daily reminder that their accusations had damaged more than just one woman's life. She misses you, he said quietly. She draws pictures of you, asks about you constantly. She never believed. She knew we were wrong from the beginning. Children see clearly, Maria replied. They haven't learned yet to see people's clothes and skin color before they see their hearts. The gentle rebuke carried no malice, but it highlighted the prejudices that had made their false accusations possible in the first place. Carmen, the kitchen director, stepped forward then. Maria, she said gently, why don't you take a few minutes? I can handle the lunch prep. She offered Charles no greeting or acknowledgement. Her loyalty clearly belonged to the woman who had volunteered hundreds of hours to keep hungry people fed while recovering from her own trauma. Maria untied her apron and gestured toward a small office at the back of the kitchen. Charles followed her through the bustling workspace, noting how many people nodded respectfully to Maria as she passed. Whatever reputation she had lost in wealthy circles, she had clearly earned new respect among people who understood the value of work, performed without expectation of recognition or reward. The office was tiny and cluttered, decorated with children's drawings and thank you letters from families who had been helped through difficult times. Charles sat awkwardly in a folding chair, while Maria settled behind a desk that was barely large enough to hold a computer and stacks of meal planning forms. For several minutes, they sat in silence, broken only by the sounds of kitchen work continuing beyond the thin walls. I brought something that belongs to you, Charles finally said, pulling a small package from his coat pocket. Inside was Maria's grandmother's watch, its worn leather strap and scratched face exactly as she remembered. You left this behind. I hoped you might want it back. Maria's composure finally cracked when she saw the watch, tears flowing down her cheeks as she cradled the timepiece in her weathered hands. She told me time would teach me what I needed to know, she whispered, that patience would bring understanding, even when nothing made sense. She fastened the familiar weight around her wrist where it belonged. What would it take, Charles asked hesitantly, for you to consider forgiving us, coming back? Emma needs you, and honestly, so do I. The house isn't the same without you. Nothing tastes right, nothing feels... He paused, searching for words to describe the absence of warmth that money couldn't replace. Maria looked at him seriously, weighing his request against months of pain and the hard-won independence she had achieved through work that mattered in ways her previous employment never had. Mr. Whitman, she said finally, I forgave you months ago because carrying anger only makes your own heart heavy. But forgiveness and trust are different things. Trust has to be earned back, one day at a time, one choice at a time. And I'm not sure either of us is ready for that work yet. Charles nodded, understanding that the damage they had caused couldn't be repaired through good intentions alone. What if we started smaller, he suggested. What if Emma visited you here sometimes? What if she learned to cook not just from recipes, but for people who need food rather than just want entertainment? The proposal surprised them both. Charles hadn't planned to suggest sharing his granddaughter with the world of service and sacrifice that Maria had discovered. Emma is always welcome here, Maria replied, her voice softening at the mention of the child who had never lost faith in her innocence. Children need to understand that cooking can be love made visible in many different ways, not just in grand houses for wealthy families, but in places like this, for people who truly appreciate every meal because they understand hunger. They talked for another hour, carefully building the foundation for relationships that would need time and consistency to heal properly. Charles learned about Maria's work at the community kitchen, the satisfaction she found in serving people who thanked her genuinely for every meal. Maria listened to his accounts of Emma's grief and the hollow atmosphere that had settled over the mansion since her departure. When Charles finally left, his expensive car looked absurdly out of place among the beat-up trucks and bicycles typically parked outside the community kitchen. But he carried with him something more valuable than the millions in assets that comprised his net worth. The possibility of redemption, the hope that some mistakes could be forgiven, even if they could never be completely forgotten. Maria returned to her work preparing lunch for 40 people who would arrive hungry and leave satisfied, her grandmother's watch ticking steadily on her wrist as time moved forward toward possibilities she couldn't yet imagine but was willing to consider. The fog outside began lifting, revealing patches of blue sky that promised clearer weather ahead, not perfect conditions, but improvement worth believing in. Time moved differently in the months that followed, marked not by stock market fluctuations or board meeting schedules, but by the slower rhythm of healing that required patience and consistency rather than dramatic gestures. Charles began visiting the community kitchen regularly, not as Maria's former employer, but as a volunteer, learning to serve food to people whose need was immediate and real rather than simply preferential and expensive. His initial attempts at basic kitchen work were clumsy and humbling, chopping vegetables with inconsistent sizes, burning rice, struggling with tasks that Maria performed with unconscious artistry. But she guided him with the same gentle patience she had once shown Emma, understanding that learning to serve others required developing humility that wealth and power typically discouraged. Emma's first visit to the community kitchen was a revelation that would reshape her understanding of cooking's true purpose. She arrived holding her grandfather's hand, eyes wide at the bustle of activity and variety of people waiting in line for lunch. Maria greeted them both with careful warmth, still cautious about rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by betrayal, but willing to start small. "Misha," Maria said to Emma, using the endearment that had always made the little girl's face light up. "Today you learned something new about cooking. We make food for people who need it, not just people who want it. The ingredients are simple, but the caring is the same." Emma nodded solemnly, ready to absorb another important lesson from the woman she had never stopped loving. Together they prepared simple meals that would feed dozens of families, vegetable soup enriched with love rather than expensive ingredients, bread that rose through patience rather than artisanal flour, rice and beans that became satisfying through skilled seasoning rather than exotic spices. Emma learned to see past her previous assumptions about good food requiring expensive components, understanding that satisfaction came from careful preparation and generous hearts rather than impressive presentation. The transformation in the Whitman family dynamic was gradual but unmistakable. Emma began talking about her volunteer work with excitement that her previous privileged experiences had never generated. Charles found himself looking forward to Thursday mornings at the community kitchen with anticipation he hadn't felt about anything in years. Even James Jr., initially skeptical about his daughter spending time in what he considered an inappropriate environment, began to notice positive changes in Emma's attitude and behavior that expensive private schools hadn't achieved. Maria watched these changes with cautious hope, recognizing genuine growth while remaining protective of the independence and self-respect she had fought to rebuild during her months of hardship. The community kitchen had become her sanctuary, a place where her skills were valued and her contributions recognized by people who understood the true cost of every meal. Returning to private household service, even for a family she had once cared about deeply, would require careful consideration of what she might be giving up in exchange for financial security. The resolution came through Emma's initiative rather than adult negotiation. On a foggy Saturday morning, 6 months after Charles's first visit to the community kitchen, Emma appeared at the mansion carrying a worn notebook filled with recipes she had collected from Maria and other volunteers. "Grandpa," she announced with determination that reminded Charles startlingly of his late wife, "I want to learn to cook real food, not just fancy food, and I want Abuela Maria to teach me in our kitchen the way she used to." "Emma," Charles said carefully, "Maria has important work at the community kitchen. We can't just ask her to give that up because we want her back." But Emma had clearly thought through her proposal more thoroughly than he'd realized. "She doesn't have to give it up," Emma replied. "She could teach me in the mornings and work at the community kitchen in the afternoons. And maybe sometimes we could cook there too, and bring the food here for dinner parties that actually help people instead of just impressing them." The suggestion was innocent in its complexity, proposing changes that would require the Whitman family to examine their values and priorities in fundamental ways. When Charles presented Emma's proposal to Maria, he found her in the community kitchen preparing for their busiest day of the week. The lunch service on Sundays typically fed over 100 people, families with children, elderly individuals living on limited incomes, working people whose paychecks didn't stretch to cover both rent and food. Maria moved through the controlled chaos with serene efficiency, managing volunteers and coordinating meal service with skills that any professional kitchen would value highly. "Emma wants to learn," Charles explained, "but she wants to learn the way you taught her before, with stories about why we cook, not just how. She thinks—" He paused, still feeling awkward about discussing his family's lifestyle changes. "She thinks we should use our house differently, that having so much space and money should mean something more than just comfortable living." Maria looked at him thoughtfully, seeing not the wealthy businessman who had once questioned her integrity, but a grandfather struggling to raise a child with values that money alone couldn't provide. "What are you really asking, Mr. Whitman?" she said gently. "Because this isn't about cooking lessons, is it?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, watching Maria efficiently coordinate meal service for people whose gratitude was immediate and genuine. Finally, he answered with honesty that felt unfamiliar but necessary. "I'm asking if you think someone like me can learn to be better. If people like us can use what we have in ways that matter. If Emma can grow up understanding that wealth is responsibility, not just privilege." The conversation continued over several weeks, building toward an arrangement that would satisfy everyone's legitimate needs while honoring the growth that each of them had experienced during their separation. Maria would return to the Whitman household 3 mornings a week, teaching Emma advanced cooking skills while preparing family meals. But her afternoons would remain committed to the community kitchen, and she had final say over any dinner parties or entertaining that would require her labor. More importantly, the Whitmans would establish a foundation supporting community kitchens throughout San Francisco, with Maria serving as an advisor, ensuring that programs actually served people effectively, rather than simply making wealthy donors feel good about their charitable contributions. Emma would continue volunteering regularly, learning that privilege carried obligations to serve others, rather than simply expecting service. The official reconciliation took place on a Sunday morning in the Mission District, with 3 generations of Whitmans serving breakfast to families in the community kitchen where Maria had rebuilt her sense of purpose and self-worth. Emma worked beside her beloved Abuela Maria, both of them wearing simple aprons stained with honest work. Charles ladled soup with careful attention to portion sizes, understanding that wasting food was different when people's next meal wasn't guaranteed. "You know," Emma said to Maria as they cleaned up after the morning service, "I think I understand now why you always wore that old watch instead of asking Grandpa for a nice one." Maria smiled, looking down at the worn timepiece that had marked every important moment of her adult life. "Time teaches us what matters, mija," Maria replied. "Some lessons take years to learn, but the waiting makes them more valuable when they finally arrive." Emma nodded seriously, filing away another piece of wisdom from the woman who had taught her that love could be measured in perfectly seasoned rice and patient instruction, in forgiveness extended despite betrayal, and in second chances that had to be earned through changed behavior rather than simple regret. The fog that had covered San Francisco for days finally began lifting, revealing golden sunshine that promised clearer skies ahead. In the community kitchen and in the mansion's restored warmth, different kinds of families were learning to appreciate what they had been given, whether it was simple food gratefully received or opportunities to serve others with abundance they had previously taken for granted. And on Maria's wrist, her grandmother's watch continued its steady measure of time passing, no longer counting down to confrontation and loss, but forward toward possibility and redemption that had seemed impossible just a year before. Some things, once broken, could indeed be repaired with patience, humility, and the kind of love that transformed simple ingredients into nourishment for both body and soul. 3 years later, the Whitman Mansion in Pacific Heights had been transformed from a showcase of private wealth into something resembling a community center with elegant accommodations. The formal dining room that had once hosted impressive but ultimately meaningless business dinners now served monthly fundraising events for local food banks and homeless shelters. Emma, now 13, moved between the kitchen and dining room with confidence that came from understanding her role as both privileged child and committed servant to her community. Maria's position in the household had evolved into something unprecedented in her experience. She was no longer simply an employee, but a valued family member whose wisdom carried weight in decisions both large and small. Her mornings were spent teaching Emma advanced culinary techniques that went far beyond basic cooking, incorporating lessons about nutrition, food costs, and the cultural significance of meals that connected families across generations and economic circumstances. The kitchen itself reflected these changes, its sterile perfection replaced by warmth that came from constant use for meaningful purposes. Shelves that had once held expensive gadgets used only for special occasions now contained supplies for the baking sessions that Emma and Maria conducted twice weekly, preparing desserts for the community kitchen and local senior centers. The industrial-grade equipment installed during Roland's brief tenure had been put to better use, heating large batches of soup and stew that fed dozens of people rather than impressing small groups of wealthy guests. Charles's transformation had been the most dramatic of all. The man who had once measured success purely in financial terms now kept careful records of meals served, families helped, and young people taught to cook nutritious food on limited budgets. His investment portfolio still generated impressive returns, but the satisfaction he found in strategic philanthropy exceeded anything he had experienced during decades of wealth accumulation for its own sake. Board meetings and profit projections continued to demand his attention, but they shared space in his calendar with volunteer shifts and foundation planning sessions that energized him in ways that mergers and acquisitions never had. Emma's friends from private school often visited the mansion now, drawn initially by curiosity about her unusual extracurricular activities, but staying because of the genuine warmth they experienced in a household where cooking and serving others had become family traditions rather than paid services performed by invisible workers. Many of these privileged children had never experienced the satisfaction of preparing food that would be appreciated by people who truly needed it, and Maria's patient instruction opened their eyes to possibilities they had never considered. Cooking is mathematics and chemistry and art all at once, Maria explained to a group of Emma's classmates during one of their weekend sessions. But most important, it is conversation between your heart and someone else's hunger. When you understand that conversation, every meal becomes a gift instead of just fuel. The teenagers nodded with the seriousness of young people discovering that their advantages could be transformed into opportunities to serve rather than just consume. The community kitchen had also evolved, benefiting from the Whitman Foundation's support in ways that went beyond simple financial contributions. Professional equipment donations allowed them to serve larger numbers more efficiently. Refrigeration upgrades meant they could store fresh ingredients safely for longer periods. But perhaps most valuable were the connections Maria facilitated between the community kitchen and other organizations serving similar populations, creating networks of mutual support that multiplied everyone's effectiveness. Maria's personal life had stabilized in ways she had never dared to hope during those dark months of unemployment and social isolation. Her reputation in the broader community had been restored through word-of-mouth recommendations from families she served and trained. But more importantly, she had discovered work that fed her soul as much as it supported her financial needs. The combination of teaching Emma and maintaining her leadership role at the community kitchen provided variety and challenge that pure domestic service had never offered. Her small apartment in the Mission District remained her sanctuary, but it no longer felt like a retreat from a hostile world. Friends from the community kitchen visited regularly, along with parents of children she had taught to cook and volunteers who had learned organizational skills through working beside her. The social isolation that had made her months of hardship particularly painful had been replaced by authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than employer-employee dynamics. The watch on her wrist, still her grandmother's worn timepiece despite Charles's repeated offers to replace it with something more expensive, had become a symbol of resilience rather than simply a family heirloom. Young people who worked with Maria often asked about its significance, and she would explain how time had indeed taught her what mattered most: the importance of patient endurance, the possibility of redemption, and the truth that real wealth came through relationships built on genuine care rather than financial transactions. Emma's development into a thoughtful, service-oriented teenager reflected all of these influences. Unlike many of her private school classmates, she understood money as a tool for helping others rather than simply a means of personal gratification. Her college application essays would eventually focus on the lessons she had learned through cooking for homeless families, the insights gained by working alongside people whose circumstances differed dramatically from her own, and her plans to study nutrition and public health with goals of expanding community-based food programs. "I want to be like Abuela Maria when I grow up," she told her grandfather during one of their evening conversations about her future plans. "Not because I want to be a cook, but because I want to be someone who makes people feel at home when they're hungry." Charles smiled, understanding that this ambition reflected values he wished he had learned decades earlier in his own life. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond San Francisco, supporting community kitchens and food programs in other cities, while developing models that could be replicated by other wealthy families seeking meaningful ways to use their resources. Maria traveled occasionally to consult with organizations in other locations, sharing expertise gained through years of feeding people efficiently and lovingly on limited budgets. These trips provided her with perspectives on poverty and food insecurity that enriched her local work while connecting her to a network of people committed to similar service. But the most satisfying moments still came during ordinary days in kitchens filled with the sounds and smells of food being prepared with care. Whether teaching Emma to prepare mole sauce with proper attention to spice balance, coordinating meal service for 100 people at the community kitchen, or simply preparing family dinner that brought 3 generations together around the same table, Maria found fulfillment that transcended any paycheck or recognition. The fog that rolled in from the Pacific each evening no longer felt oppressive to her. It was simply part of San Francisco's rhythm, temporary weather that cleared to reveal sunshine and possibility. Just as the darkness of her false accusation and unemployment had eventually lifted to show new opportunities, the city's moody skies reminded her that difficult periods could be endured because they were not permanent conditions. And have you ever cooked for someone who never said thank you? Tell me in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who cooks with her soul. For more emotional stories like this, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this journey of the heart. We'll see you in our next story.